Joining me now is Akela Lacy. She is the politics reporter for TheIntercept.com. Previously, she was The Intercept's inaugural A.D. Barkin reporting fellow, and she recently published a piece with Ryan Grimm entitled "The Entire Staff of the Nevada Democratic Party Quits After Democratic Socialist Slate Won Every Seat." Akela, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm okay, Ben. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Pleasure is ours. I want to dig into your reporting. Let's just go straight into it, because one of the number one things that those of us who want to do better in this country have normally positioned ourselves to do, two routes. You have the inside track and the outside track. And those of us who promote running on the inside track, we always talk about going to the party level, on the state level, local level, and becoming a part of the Democratic Party to win from the inside. You had Democratic Socialists of America, Democratic Socialists, who actually did that and then won. And when they won, the entire infrastructure and the team that was there previously quit. Do I have that right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that story?
Yeah. So basically this slate backed by DSA in Nevada, I think every person on the slate except for one member was a dues paying DSA member in their local DSA chapter. They ran on a slate to take over the leadership of the Nevada State Democratic Party. They won all of the seats, and they were notified, I believe, the day afterwards by the executive director that the entire staff would be quitting. Just a point of note, the executive director had gotten a job with the DNC back in February, so it was known that she would be leaving, but the remaining four staff quit abruptly, which, I mean, is not all of that surprising when you talk about, like expecting there to be sort of staff turnover when there's a change in leadership in the party. But what really was the kicker in this situation is that not only did they send this kind of ruthless email letting the new chair know that they were all going to be quitting immediately, but they were taking severance and they were ending the contracts with all of the vendors that had worked with the party. And then they also had moved, I believe it was $450,000 out of the state committee account to both the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee and out of state consultants. So they left, they took all their money with them, and they took a little bit extra on the way out. Which, yeah, I mean, you're talking about this inside outside strategy. That's exactly what this group of people had been, working in line with. This is not something that happened overnight. This is something that they had been working towards since before 2016, and particularly had picked up momentum after Bernie Sanders won the Nevada caucus in this last cycle.
I'm listening to this and part of me is like, good riddance. We have the capacity to help raise that money and to replace the money that was taken. But it does just show that, to me, that they never intended to deal in good faith with people with just ever so slightly different politics, right? More progressive politics, people who are going to fight for 15 an hour, people who are going to fight for Medicare for all, people who are going to fight for the new Green Deal. And once those people came and because you don't win at the state level without doing a lot of work, right? You might can luck up and win at a local committee, a local chapter. Maybe you have a small county and there's only like 10 people there and you can talk your way into a seat on the executive committee or something. But on the state level, that's a lot of work. That means that these people who won have been consistently and diligently participating in the state party for some time. And when they actually got victory, the state party was like, oh, well, take our balls and go home.
Yeah, they had won a majority on a smaller board earlier this summer. People were sort of like the party was sort of thrown into disarray with Sanders' win in this last cycle in the caucuses. And I mean, to the point where I think this is a really interesting aspect of the story that, the line that the the previous staff were sort of using against the new slate is that they were trying to be divisive and that they were trying to, they weren't willing to work across the party to cooperate or build relationships with moderates or people who didn't disagree with them. And then as soon as they were presented with people who disagreed with them, they went running. I mean, one of the details in the piece that we thought was pretty funny is that the DSA slate was titled the Progressive Slate and the Establishment Slate was titled the Progressive Unity Slate, right? So like we're the ones who want unification. We're the ones who want to work together, but we're not going to give you all a chance to govern. But yeah, to your point, this is something that they have been working towards for a very long time. They've been, the DSA's numbers grew. They exploded, between 2016 and 2020. They're still working. I mean, they're still working to sort of build this infrastructure in the state. So I think it just speaks to the amount of work that they've been able to do in, both in a relatively short period of time and also like to the strategy of building this over a long period of time. Yeah.
So have you talked with any of the new state leadership, right? The slate that won. Have you talked to them, and what are they feeling in terms of this game that's been played, the money that has been shifted, which all of it's legal. They did it properly. They can transfer those dollars. But what is the sentiment from the new leadership there? So
I've spoken with Judith Whitmer, who is the new executive director of the party or the chair of the party. They were not given access to list of staff or information that they needed to sort of start the transition until I believe late on Monday. The election took place on Saturday, and they, between then and when we first started talking with them about this, they hadn't been, they said that the previous staff weren't cooperating with them, that they didn't even know a full list of the staff who had resigned at that point. So they're feeling, I think they sort of part of them expected something like this to happen. I don't think that they expected them to take the money with them and to take severance. And I think they're feeling, both vindicated in that, this is sort of what they've been, trying to point out for a long time, that like this animosity towards the left is, it's all, we hear about Bernie bros all the time. We hear about how toxic the left can be and how, this is the strategy that we saw in Congress, Democrats will do basically anything to keep the status quo and to keep people from primarying them and to keep people from attacking them from their left or challenging them from their left rather. So they're feeling that, this is an example of what they've been sort of trying to bring attention to for a long time, but also feeling like this has given them sort of momentum to come in, with the ball rolling. I think they've already raised a significant amount of money just in the last few days, based on news around this. And I also just want to point out that the Las Vegas Review Journal, a local paper, had reported on these staff departures, and then we got some more information on the emails and stuff. So, just to shout out to the local coverage that's been, they've been covering this dynamic for a really long time. So I think that has given them a little bit of, of support also.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your other piece, recent piece in The Intercept, the piece with Ayanna Pressley, Elizabeth Warren, and Senator Ed Markey, all from Massachusetts, making a move on abolishing qualified immunity. Can you tell us about that piece and any of those updates?
Absolutely. So this bill that Ed Markey and Ayanna Pressley introduced in the beginning of this month is a reintroduction of a similar bill that Ayanna Pressley had introduced last session with Justin Amash, who is no longer in Congress. So it was a bipartisan bill then. It's no longer a bipartisan bill, but they reintroduced it they had introduced it last session as an amendment to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. They introduced it this time as a separate bill. And some of the backstory on that is that some moderate Democrats led by Josh Gottheimer and Tom O'Halloran in Arizona had been pushing back to some of the provisions in the Justice and Policing Act, particularly around qualified immunity. Politico had reported that, and we had reported last December that some Democrats were sort of getting cold feet, if you will, around the concept of reforming qualified immunity, despite there having been broad bipartisan support. We're talking about from the Cato Institute to the ACLU to Tom Brady to even Clarence Thomas, thinking that there's something wrong with this doctrine, which is not a law. It's a doctrine that's been created and sustained and reinforced through legal rulings, like over time. That this is something that doesn't make sense. This sort of protection that is afforded basically to police officers are the only people, one of the only professions in the country that are afforded this sort of protection, both that helps them get around constitutional protections for other people and avoid, civil lawsuits in situations where they've violated a person's constitutional rights. So Presley and Markey have reintroduced this bill. Despite there being pushback now, and that pushback has come sort of in tandem with some of the other sort of backlash that we've seen to protests this summer, to calls to defund the police. And this is an example of how some of the sort of, the lack of nuance in some of the rhetoric around this stuff has jeopardized reforms that really were popular and had a lot of support. And so, we thought, possibly before all of this stuff happened last year, that qualified immunity might be on the table as something that, people on both sides of the party could get behind. There's actually a Republican, Mike Braun, who introduced his own bill last session to similarly reform qualified immunity. He then went on Tucker Carlson's show and swiftly, retracted that bill after pushback from police unions and police officers who started attacking him. We reported that a similar thing happened with Bill Pascrell, a congressman from New Jersey, who said he didn't want to be made to, quote unquote, walk the plank on qualified immunity during the infamous call that House Democrats had after midterms last year. So we had a sense that this was going to be an issue. The fact that they've introduced this bill, this goes further than the provision in the JPA. This would actually completely end qualified immunity. What's currently in JPA would only limit it. And even people didn't even want it to be limited. Like, people wanted to water down that provision. And so this is, an unprecedented push. I'm not exactly sure how much it has a chance of success. But the other piece I wanted to add on this is that the Congresswoman was able to negotiate in exchange for her voting yes on the Justice and Policing Act. She was able to negotiate a series of hearings in the Judiciary Committee on police reform, and specifically a markup on their qualified immunity bill, which is huge. She's not even on the Judiciary Committee. Right. And I think it just speaks to sort of this disconnect between all of the rhetoric that we're hearing around JPA, how good it is, how much of a sweeping, set of reforms it is. And in many ways, that's true. But a lot of these things are already illegal at the local level. I think a lot of people in Congress are frustrated that it's taken even this long to get something like this back on the floor. And at the end of the day, it's unclear how much impact it will really have. And so the fact that Congresswoman Presley, who's been advocating and one of the loudest advocates for putting some of these reforms into the congressional conversation and onto the floor, had the foresight to say, okay, well, we don't want the American people to think that this is all we're going to do on this. Right. We can pass this bill, but we actually need to have congressional discussions about these other things, about looking into consent decrees, looking into marking up this bill. So I think that is even more of an interesting kind of spin on what's been happening. Yeah.
And it is depressing, but also sobering, I think, is the word I'm looking for. The pushback that's coming from within circles of the Democratic Party, who literally need the black vote, minority votes, the people who are the direct victims, the disproportionate victims of police brutality. And so what in your reporting, or what have you found in terms of the justification that's coming? Like, how are they holding that balance in their head? The fact that they need us to vote, but once we get them in there, they themselves, not Congresswoman and not Senator Markey, obviously, or Senator Elizabeth Warren, because they're leading the charge in this regard, but they are getting pushback from the establishment that literally needs our votes. What did you find in that?
It's unfortunate because I think that the conversation right now is still really focused on how this conversation around policing alienated white voters in moderate districts, and not how it boosted Democratic registration, how it engaged Black and brown voters in ways that we haven't seen ever before. That is treated as something that's insignificant in Democratic strategy, which I think it's depressing, but it's not surprising at all.
Right.
Moderates and party leadership are more afraid of the power that police forces and police unions have to message on this stuff, whether it's true or not. Part of the thing that's so frustrating about this conversation about defund the police is that I think there's, less than 5 members of Congress that have ever even said those words. This is not something that the party is running on. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that the idea that this whole conversation is so toxic to the Democratic Party strategy is really sort of like, a galaxy brain take. Like, they're not running on this. They're doing the bare minimum, and they're still being controlled by these forces that are coming out and saying, okay, well, if you're going to vote for this, like, we're going to retract our police union endorsement. Like, we're going to turn all these people against you. And unfortunately, I think the calculation has been that matters more than engaging and listening to the things that Black and brown voters have been asking for and demanding.
That's the rub. That's the rub right there, right? The fact that the establishment, the Democratic establishment, has already done the calculus, and they are landing squarely on the side of police unions who have just historically been part and parcel with the abuse and the murder and the systemic oppression of Black people. I mean, just the role that police unions play, it supersedes even the police departments, right? Because we've seen these police unions become quite active in their advocacy against the Black Lives Matter movement and against people who are standing up against police brutality. And from what I'm hearing you say, you're saying that, yes, it is the fact that the Democratic establishment has sided with that side of the conversation versus the millions of people that they need to be enthusiastic about going out and voting for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's my analysis of the situation. And I mean, you can look at some of this stuff like Bill Pascrell, the person I mentioned who first kind of brought up being made to walk the plank on this, is the top recipient of police money in all of Congress. Josh Gottheimer is one of the next top recipients of police money in all of Congress. Tom O'Halloran is an ex-police officer. Like, it's not a secret. And for some reason, the conversation is still around, oh, well, how did these calls, really alienate moderate voters? How does this, like, these attack ads that Republicans were running against, frontline Democrats, almost, had them lose their seats, when we're talking about people who voted against the last stimulus bill. Like, we're talking about things that have almost no connection to reality. And the common denominator is that it's lines coming from law enforcement. So yes, unfortunately, that is what I think is going on. Yeah.
Akela Lacy, politics reporter for theintercept.com. Thank you for covering these two particular stories and all the work that you're doing.
Thanks for having me, Ben.